Hi, and welcome to Rontime. Today is February 21st, 2014, and here we are rolling into, uh, let's see, Chinese New Year is, Chinese New Year, this is a 7 in Chinese numerology, and that's actually a very good number for commerce, for trade, for opening of communications. And it's interesting to see how communications can facilitate change, as it did in Egypt and as it did in Sudan and as it's currently doing in Kiev. And communications is so important. It's so critical. Here we are in Tucson, Arizona, home of the La Fiesta de los Vaqueros, a tradition in Tucson since ranching days, and the importance of the cattle industry in Arizona as one of the 5 Cs: cotton, citrus, copper, cattle, and canyons, I think. I don't know. That was so long ago. But recently, our mayor here in Tucson has been talking about replacing the 5 Cs with different letters, which stand for trade and access and communications and all kinds of good stuff. He's also a good gardener, which is good. You know, I've been an advocate for quite some time of grow food, not lawns. And wherever I see a nice grass lawn growing, I think of all the organic produce that could be grown there in its place. It'd be a much better utilization of the soil, the water, and the carbon that's drifting around in the atmosphere that the plants sequester. Speaking of plants and sequestration, it's now a known fact that cannabis and hemp sequester 4 times more carbon than any other species of plant on the surface of the earth. And it just seems so logical to me that this is the time for legalization of both of those crops for carbon sequestration, as well as all the other benefits that can be gained from growing those 2 plant species, which, by the way, were both banned to favor big business and big government, especially since the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons has been turned into a profit center for for-profit prisons to manufacture products for the Koch brothers at 18 to 20 cents an hour wages. So they don't even have to offshore. They don't have to go overseas. They don't have to worry about imports or duties or any of that. They just have their products made in prison labor camps. Here in the United States, we have more prisoners per capita than any other nation on earth, and that includes the gulags of Russia. Now that's an interesting fact. How did that become that way? Well, mandatory sentencing for possession of cannabis and mandatory first-time offense, including jail time, has been standardized state by state with lobbying from the DEA, who still refuses to allow public access to studies that prove that cannabinoid oils kill all 3 known forms of breast cancer in the body, in the bloodstream, without any residual harm and without the costly and very damaging procedures that pass for cancer cures in America today, including radiation, chemotherapy, and physical removal operations. So, since 1937, when cannabis was made a Class 1 narcotic because a gentleman named Harry Anslinger lied to Congress and said that it caused white women to need to have sexual relations with blacks Puerto Ricans, entertainers, and others. And believe it or not, that's the congressional testimony before a committee in a hearing that was then closed, the motion tabled, and the classification went on without any public access and without any documentation, other than the testimony of Harry J. Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who, in forming the FBN, was very, very jealous of J. Edgar Hoover's organization called the FBI. And he knew he was going to inherit 10,000 Tommy gun certified federal agents. So he had to create a new boogeyman, a new public enemy number one that would allow the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons to turn into large-scale industries, mainly because they were only arresting people of color and musicians and Puerto Ricans and entertainers. If you follow the logic behind Harry Anslinger, he was a white supremacist and one of the first public officials in America to completely shave his body and to completely shave his head. And this is in the 20s and 30s when it was quite unusual for someone to look like that. Anyway, he lied to Congress in 37. Since that time, the DEA has continued to quash studies that prove that cannabinoid oils are the most effective cancer cure for all three known types of breast cancer. Those studies have been suppressed for so long that literally hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million women have died from breast cancer unnecessarily because a drug enforcement agency had to have a public enemy number one easy bust drug, cannabis, because mostly blacks, Hispanics, and jazz musicians were the only ones who used it. And in fact, in creating legislation in the state of New York, the first state to make cannabis illegal in 1924, they called it that Mexican problem because the only source at that time was Mexico. And the only people that used it, as I said, were blacks, jazz musicians, entertainers, and Puerto Ricans. So you can see by creating them as a class to pick on with a very easy cops and robbers scam called, oh, you stink like weed, you're going to jail. And by the way, if you're caught in Tucson, Arizona, in a vehicle and sent to Tucson City Court, if you had a $20 bag of marijuana in your car, the fine is $1,450 in the city of Tucson at City Court. So you can see how this has been turned into an economic engine that mostly affects people of color. 4 out of 5 prisoners in America today are persons of color. 4 out of 5 prisoners on earth today are in American prisons and American jails. Why? Because they are for-profit centers for the Koch brothers and their conservative buddies who pushed and pushed and pushed through the American Legislative Exchange Council mandatory sentencing for first-time nonviolent offenders for possession of cannabis, and continuing to lie not only about gateway drugs, but continuing to lie and call cannabis a class 1 narcotic, when in fact no one has ever OD'd on cannabis. So it is technically impossible for it to be a narcotic. You cannot get physically addicted to it as you can with heroin or cocaine. They are physically addictive. And guess what? They're only class 2 narcotics. So, by having cannabis declared a class 1 narcotic, Harry Anslinger and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics started a game of cops and robbers that's been pushed and pushed and pushed through every presidential administration when they had an opportunity to tell the truth and to admit that the entire cannabis regulation is a lie. A white lie. A white lie to suppress people of color into economic misfortune, because when you get out of prison and you've served your time, you're still not given your rights back. You still have to apply to become a citizen again and have the right to vote. You still have to apply to have your record expunged so that it's not public record for anybody to look up. You still have to do all the work yourself, going into a community where jobs are frequently not offered to marijuana felons or cannabis criminals because of the prevailing ignorance and attitude about cannabis that is not based on fact. And when you have attorneys like Bill Montgomery, who is the attorney for Maricopa County, who is so ignorant of marijuana that he thinks that one exposure to it makes you an addict for life. The gentleman knows none of the facts over which he has the power to rule everyone's lives in Maricopa County who uses cannabis or even smells like cannabis. Okay? So, what are you recommending, Ron? You must be recommending something. It's rodeo week. Okay, because it's rodeo week, here's what I recommend. Cowboys use cannabis for pain control, and it's very common in rodeo circles that even very straight, uptight, redneck cowboys will occasionally smoke what they call heifer dust to relieve the pain and suffering that's caused by being a cowboy. That life is hard on your joints and hard on your spine and very, very hard on your hands. And cannabinoids happen to be very, very effective pain control. They also happen to be extremely effective in healing several fields of vision, including deep myopia and when you have a low interocular pressure and your eyeball isn't formed into the right shape because of that interocular pressure, cannabis will relieve that 100%. It's also extremely useful in post-traumatic stress disorder treatments. And yet the federal government still continues to prosecute in 48 states. Now, what does it say that the 2 states that legalized it through the process of citizen votes overriding the legislature, which refused medical marijuana and refused legalization, the citizens there deserve the credit for being a real democracy, for taking the action into their own hands to actually say to the federal government and to the state of Colorado and the state of Washington, it is time for the facts to be revealed. It is time to tell the truth about what cannabinoids are and how they work and what they do in the human body. And it's also time for everyone who was ever prosecuted under cannabinoid law that their rights be fully restored and that an apology be given by the federal government for lying since 1937 and for causing or being part of the death of hundreds of thousands of women from breast cancer. And then it's time for the federal government to put a very serious program together to plant as much of the United States in hemp and cannabis as possible so that we become an independent, oil exporting, energy producing nation. We are currently producing 50% of the energy we consume. Now that's a big step up from the 80s and the 90s when we were importing more than 70% of our energy needs. So if hemp oil produced in the United States legally in all the states were a export product, the United States of America could have a zero deficit in a period of 3 to 5 years. It's that simple. There's 3 crops a year. It requires no minimum pesticides and insecticides because it has no native enemies, and it actually sequesters 4 times more carbon than any other plant on Earth, and therefore ought to be used to offset the crude carbon industries that are still allowed to burn coal in your atmosphere and put noxious gases, including mercury vapor, into the atmosphere that you and I breathe, and into the water that you and I drink. And while I was taping this show for 25 minutes, I need to remind you that every 20 seconds, somewhere on Earth, a human being died because they do not have access to sanitation or clean water or both. And in the same time that it took me to tape this show, every 37 seconds, an American was arrested for cannabis, a Class 1 narcotic. So, once again, I gotta ask, do what you can. Speak to your representatives, learn the facts, get them to learn the facts, get them to speak the facts and the truth, and legalize hemp and cannabis in the United States. Is that understood? Is that close enough? I hope so, because I think that's the end of Rontime. Thank you for inviting me into your living room, and have a nice day.